just amplifying on the notion that America is still a fairly unsettled, unresolved country. That's one of the things that makes it an exciting place to live and an exciting place to work, and particularly an exciting place to be a scholar and a teacher, in the sense that, you know, you're not simply teaching from an already codified, solidified, reified set of precepts or rules, but instead we, in many respects, you know, fairly literally, are still kind of writing the rules by which our society operates. And perhaps nowhere more so is that true than with respect to ethics, and the extent to which ethics informs both the law and also public policy. And one of the major expressions of public policy in the early 21st century in the United States has to do specifically with the environment and with sustainable, both sustainable environmental policy and also sustainable economics. And I think, you know, you guys, those of you who know English reasonably well, are familiar with the terms sustainable and sustainability. But I think it would be useful for me to define that just from the beginning. A sustainable activity is something that you can continue to do indefinitely into the future with no end point. So if I have a bowl of fruit, and every day I eat one piece of fruit, within a few days that bowl is empty. But if that bowl of fruit is replenished, if every day I take one piece out and eat it and put back one piece, then I have a sustainable supply of fruit. Every day there will be fruit in the bowl for me to eat. So this is, and again, I spoke about the United States being a fairly young nation. This is a new idea for us, because until fairly recently we felt that the fruit bowl was infinite, that we could continue to take from it and would never have to put anything back, and that there would always be more. And this in part is because of the fact that the United States, at least from a European perspective, is a very recently colonized country and an extremely large country. Imagine if the population of Taiwan all of a sudden discovered China and China was empty. You had literally thousands of kilometers in every direction of natural resources, minerals, agricultural land, animals, and so forth. So you could continue to take and take and take, and it would seem, at least initially, as though these things would never run out, would never be exhausted. But we have now, in the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, realized that that was only an illusion, a myth. So I think that realization that we do not literally have unlimited resources is something that came to the American consciousness fairly late, but at the same time has triggered a new round of environmental thought, and specifically of environmental ethical thought. And to that end, I'd like to just begin with some of those prepared remarks for those of you who want to follow along in the Green Book. And a few of the questions, I think, that seem particularly relevant to me in the teaching that I do, both at Lewis Clark State in the United States and now here at Hòa Văn, have to do with the relationship between human beings, both individual human beings and collectively as an entire society on the one hand, and our relationship with the rest of the world on the other hand. And that rest of the world we can, roughly speaking, call nature. One of the questions, does humankind have a legitimate place in wild nature? Is there or should there be really a clear separation between the human world and the non-human or natural world? And should we call nature something separate from ourselves, or are we a part of nature, and is nature a part of us? And I think pretty clearly that echoes some of the questions that Professor Lin was asking just a moment ago. In addition, does wild nature have a place in the modern world? Have we become such a sophisticated, such a complex civilization, technologically advanced society, that we no longer really have room for nature, or no longer have a need for it, except perhaps as a museum piece, as something that we see one day a month maybe at a zoo, or something that we experience only in symbolic terms, as symbols or images of nature, perhaps on television or by a computer? Or is nature something that is, in a sense, a kind of an artifact, a museum piece, something that is from the past, but no longer really has a place in our very modern, technologically advanced, even virtual world? And I find that the more I think about environmental issues in philosophy, the more difficult it is for me to defend a single position where I'm right, the other guy is plain wrong. And that, I think, has to a large degree motivated the direction of this talk, the idea of there being distinct positions in terms of American environmental ethics, but backing away from the notion that there's one of them that really I would intend to privilege or identify as singularly right. But at the same time, I think it's important to understand that the idea of compromise, even while it's a very good thing in human relationships, particularly perhaps in marriages or boyfriend-girlfriend relationships, very important to compromise. When one is dealing with environmental issues or questions, compromise is not always a desirable thing. We bring to mind the idea of King Solomon from the Old Testament and the Bible, who was given a baby, and two different parents were arguing over ownership of the baby, and he said, well, we'll just cut the baby in half. So, applying that idea of Solomonic justice to questions of nature and the environment are not always particularly useful, in my opinion. If the question is, should we clear-cut this forest, an acceptable solution is not to clear-cut half the forest. That's still causing ecological damage and habitat loss, perhaps even species extinction. Often losing half of what habitat is left dooms species dependent on that habitat to rapid extinction, due largely to the governing reality of minimum viable population, which is an ecological principle that establishes a numerical limit, a population number, below which a stable breeding population cannot maintain itself. And this dynamic comes into play in my part of the United States, for example, with questions of salmon recovery, migratory fish, as well as wolf and grizzly bear reintroduction plans. First major position that I'd like to talk about can, roughly speaking, be called the deconstructionist view. And this begins by asking a fairly basic question, not a rhetorical question, of whether there really is such a thing as nature, as distinct from human civilization. Are humans, perhaps, we could say that humans are ourselves part of nature. Certainly that's a position that Walt Whitman would approve of, that Professor Lin would approve of, and in fact I approve of, that humans are, among other things, animals, are part of nature. But at the same time, from a deconstructionist perspective, then one jumps to what I would consider an unwarranted conclusion that there is no such thing as nature.